Welcome everyone to today's EPAC webinar. Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis heureux au nom de l'APEC on behalf of EPAC. I'm very pleased to be welcoming you to a very important webinar that brings us up to date on new policy directions. Osama is our technical host. And Osama, if you can mute everybody else, so that way we'll have only one speaker at a time. Right now, I have the honor of being that person. So, as I said, welcome everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Whoops. Oh no, I hit the wrong thing. Sorry. Here we go. I will be back in shortly. Yikes, where are we? I'm very sorry.
No problem.
No presentation
Bob.
is complete
I'll just,
without technical glitches.
Folks are still joining
Okay.
the call, so no problem.
All right. Okay. Some people are still joining the call. Okay, well, maybe I'll go back one slide. There we go. All right. Try number 2. Welcome everyone to this very important EPAC webinar. Bonjour tout le monde. Vous êtes le bienvenu au nom de l'APEC. Je vous accueille. Cette présentation par Jessie MacNeil, notre experte pour aujourd'hui. Maintenant, instead of hitting stop sharing, I'm going to try to hit advance. All right. My name is Robert Cherney, or Bob Cherney, whichever you prefer. Everybody else should be muted so that we don't have interference in the audio. You can send messages at any time. Voudrez-vous les écrire lorsque vous avez l'idée et pas attendre pour la fin après la présentation? If you want to protect your privacy and ensure discretion, well, don't use your real name, don't identify your organization, whatever, but that's up to you. Jessie est capable de répondre à vos questions et discuter en français aussi qu'en anglais, mais l'anglais est la langue qu'elle utilisera pour la plupart du temps. And the webinar will be recorded and put on our website. One further detail, you'll notice that the slides switch between English and French, but Jessie will be able to provide us with the complete presentation in English and then another version in French. So if you wish to receive that, then please note that in the chat box, and we will get that to you as you can make it available to us. So for those of you who aren't aware yet, the Ethics Practitioners Association of Canada promotes ethical practices in organizations and supports ethics practitioners across the country, across Canada. Et cette occasion, un webinaire, c'est un de nos outils pour le faire, pour avoir opportunité de réseautage et d'éducation continuelle. This is in view of our vision of a world where people and organizations are ethically aware and act ethically. So please do visit our website and become a member of our organization. I'd like to invite Nick Séguin, who is now our EPAC president, to express his own welcome and provide the land acknowledgement, which is part of our routine nowadays. Over to you, Nick. Or Osama, if you would like to step in if Nick is not yet available.
Absolutely, yes. So thank you, Bob. So I'd like to begin this session by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all lands that we are on today. While we are meeting virtually today, it is important for each of us located somewhere in Canada to recognize the difficult history of these lands. We therefore affirm our commitment and responsibility towards improving relationships with and deepening our understanding of Indigenous peoples and their cultures locally and throughout Canada. From coast to coast to coast, I hope all of us are grateful to live on the ancestral territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations peoples. I'd like you all to join me for a moment of reflection to consider past harms and mistakes, how we each do our part to support truth and reconciliation through ethical awareness and practice. I'd like to just very quickly, I take the land acknowledgement very seriously. I believe it is our duty as Canadians and as individuals living on this land, where we are very, very fortunate to be, to go a little bit beyond the acknowledgement. I would encourage everyone here to learn a little bit about where they live, where the name of the city or town comes from. A lot of the cities and towns we live in have Indigenous roots or names that are Indigenous. Like I'm in Ottawa, for example. Ottawa comes from the word Odawa, which usually means a meeting point in the Anishinaabe culture. And we are in Ontario, which comes from the word Canadario, which means shining lake, likely referring to Lake Ontario. So I think this is the very least we can do as Canadians and people living on this land, to go a little bit beyond the acknowledgement, learn a little bit more about where we are, whether it's a treaty or a non-treaty territory. I think it's our duty as Canadians. Donc, tout d'abord, nous désirons reconnaître les peuples autochtones de toutes les terres sur lesquelles nous nous trouvons aujourd'hui. Alors que nous nous réunissons aujourd'hui sur une plateforme virtuelle, il reste important que chacun d'entre nous, situé quelque part au Canada, admettre l'histoire difficile de ces terres. Nous affirmons donc notre engagement et notre responsabilité à l'égard d'une meilleure compréhension de ces peuples et leur culture, ainsi que l'amélioration des relations avec eux au niveau local et dans tout le Canada. D'un océan à l'autre, nous sommes reconnaissants de vivre sur le territoire ancestral des peuples inuits, métis et des Premières Nations. Veuillez participer à un moment de réflexion sur les préjudices et les erreurs du passé et la façon dont nous pouvons chacun faire notre part pour soutenir la vérité et la réconciliation par la sensibilisation et la pratique éthique. Et je vous encourage d'aller un petit peu plus loin que cette simple reconnaissance, de faire un petit peu de recherche sur la ville ou l'endroit où vous habitez. Vous allez trouver sûrement que le nom de la ville ou du territoire où vous restez a probablement des racines des Premières Nations, des peuples autochtones. Je suis à Ottawa, qui vient du mot Odawa. Ça veut dire, dans la langue algonquin, ça veut dire une place de rassemblement. Et le mot Ontario vient probablement du mot Canadario, qui veut dire un lac pétillant, qui fait probablement référence au lac de l'Ontario. Donc, je vous encourage fortement d'aller un peu plus loin de la reconnaissance. Je crois que c'est notre devoir comme Canadiens, Canadiennes ou comme des personnes qui habitent sur ce territoire. Merci. Bob, I'll give it back over to you.
Thank you. So, as you've seen in our advertising, our announcements for this session, our speaker is Jessie MacNeil. Before working in the government over the past 20 years, past 16, I should say, she was a certified management consultant, and completely linked to today's topic, she was supporting the work of the Public Service Disclosure Protection Act Review Task Force on behalf of Treasury Board. So this puts her in excellent position to guide us through the key findings and recommendations. And thank you very, very much, Jessie, for stepping in and agreeing to do this presentation for us. I believe Jessie anticipates talking for 20 to 30 minutes and then hopes to have very, very important questions and vigorous discussion. Alors, à toi, Jessie.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. I'm happy to be here today to talk about the task force report. La présentation sera en anglais, mais comme Robert l'a mentionné, la moitié des diapositives sont en français et vous pouvez poser vos questions en français lors de notre période questions-réponses à la fin de la présentation. So today I'll be providing an overview of the report, sharing some of the key findings and recommendations. The full list of recommendations is available in Appendix A of the report, all in one spot. Okay, so to start, in the next slide, for a bit of background context, for those of you who may not know, I imagine most of you are aware that the Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates, OGO, reviewed the Act nearly 10 years ago, 10 years after the Act was implemented, and made 15 recommendations in their report, some of which were recommending significant changes to the legislation. So there were some administrative measures that were made or implemented after that time, but no legislative changes were made then. You're probably also familiar with Bill C-290, which was a private member's bill introduced in the House in 2021. It was an act to amend the PSDPA. So that died on the order paper at second reading in the Senate when the election was called last year. And concurrent to the review of the bill, the president of the Treasury Board announced the establishment of this task force to review the Act, and it was mandated to identify opportunities for improving and strengthening disclosure processes, improving protections and supports for whistleblowers, and recommending changes to the Act to improve its effectiveness. So the report and an accompanying survey results report were both published 2 months ago online on canada.ca. So the links are there and on the last page of the presentation as well. So the task force looked at quite a bit of information, the previous reviews, the reviews of OGO, the Public Sector Integrity Commissioner's submission to OGO, as well as Bill C-290 and international research. They also conducted a fairly extensive consultation process, speaking to various stakeholders and experts in the field. And they reviewed a total of 57 written submissions that were provided from internal and external stakeholders as well. So the task force, in the years it was operating, it covered quite a few topics, including notably the definition of wrongdoing, considered whether it should be changed or expanded, definition of reprisal, definition of protected disclosure. And they were concerned in particular about the processes in place for addressing matters that were reported but didn't necessarily meet the threshold of wrongdoing per Section 8 of the Act. They acknowledged that vexatious complaints existed and they had a significant impact on those accused. But they recommended that the qualifier of good faith be removed from the definition of protected disclosure and from elsewhere in the Act. They talked about the complexity of what they called a recourse mechanism ecosystem, so all the various channels for reporting various types of misconduct, wrongdoing. And they recommended additional clarity around the handling of anonymous disclosures. They acknowledged there was a lot of confusion around how to report, how the disclosure processes worked, and noted also the inconsistencies in the implementation of the Act across the federal public sector. So there were initially 8 members of the task force. There were 7 at the end. 1 person left to join another task force. And they were divided on whether all disclosures within the public sector should go to the Public Sector Integrity Commissioner, or whether the 2 systems should be retained, that is, internal disclosures and disclosures to PSEC. So in the end, they opted to keep both choices for public servants, but there is a kind of a minority opinion in the report that explains why some felt that all disclosures should be sent to PSEC. Okay, next slide. So an important element of the task force review was a survey a national survey. It was an online survey published in the spring of 2024. It was online for 6 weeks, and it sought input from current public servants, former public servants, contractors, as well as members of the public. And the survey addressed the themes of disclosure processes, internal disclosure processes, reprisal protections, as well as organizational culture and the administration of the Act across the public sector. So quite wide-ranging. There were over 5,000 responses, and all those that were submitted or at least 40% completed were included in the analysis and the data analysis, which was contracted out to a firm. So in the end, there were over 3,500 survey responses that fed into the review, and almost 98% of them were from current public servants, which was sort of the focus of the recommendations, the task force's recommendations. So the survey was shared with chief executives, and they were encouraged to share it with their organizations. Not everyone saw it, not everyone responded, obviously, but there were a significant number that were collected. These were optional and anonymous surveys, obviously available in both official languages. So the survey included, as I mentioned, a look at organizational culture. And there were questions to try to assess the psychological health and safety of public servants. So one important finding was that 37% of survey respondents reported working in a psychologically unsafe and unhealthy work environment. So that was one of the findings. The survey also included 4 scenarios of misconduct, ranging kind of from less serious to quite egregious in the 4th scenario. And participants or survey respondents were asked to indicate who within their organization they would speak to if they encountered that type of misconduct. And they were also asked what they thought should be done in response, and what they thought would actually happen in their organization. So the results showed quite a gap between what they thought should happen and what they felt actually would happen in these various scenarios, misconduct scenarios. And those findings, as well as stakeholder input, informed the recommendations of the task force, which included a number around accountability, including accountability for how chief executives implemented the PSDPA in their organizations, which should be, they felt, a component of the performance assessment of executives. And they also made some recommendations regarding enhancements to the public service employee survey, touching on some of these topics. So I've included the 4th scenario, the most egregious misconduct scenario that was included in the survey, which reads as follows. A senior leader in your organization yells at people, belittles them, criticizes people who complain, and is known for giving contracts to friends and in inappropriately expensing extravagant lunches. So it's quite a laundry list of misconduct items there, allegations against this senior leader in the organization. So again, respondents were asked to identify who they would go to in their organization to discuss this type of misconduct. Nearly 70% said they discuss it with their supervisor. Not nearly the same amount said they would discuss it with colleagues. And you can see the breakdown of the portions of respondents who would go to the various other avenues in their organization, including the Ethics Bureau or Ombuds Office, their union, senior official for internal disclosure in their organization, another higher level official other than the senior officer for internal disclosure, and public sector integrity commissioner, or their organization's informal conflict resolution unit. So those are the options available, and this is a breakdown, and they varied the proportion that went to different avenues sort of varied from one scenario to another, but that shows you what how people responded to that one. So the next slide reflects the responses for what people thought should happen for that particular rather egregious scenario of misconduct, serious misconduct. So only 1% of respondents felt that nothing should be done in that case. And you can see the breakdown there, how many thought there should be a written reprimand, half of them thought the individual should be suspended, 30% thought they should resign, 40% they thought they should be fired, given the scenario. And in the next slide, we see the results of what the respondents thought actually would happen in their organizations following that type of a scenario. So while 1% thought nothing should happen, 20% thought that nothing actually would happen in their organizations in that situation. And you can see the breakdown there and how it contrasts with how respondents felt the situation should be addressed. So much lower numbers for suspension, resignation, firing, written reprimands, and so on. So you can see there the gap that I mentioned earlier about what respondents thought should happen versus what they thought would actually happen in these situations. Next slide. So another thing that this survey asked about they wanted the respondents to identify which for them were the most important factors that would support the disclosure of wrongdoing in their organization. And they were asked to select up to 5 from a long list of various factors. So these are some of the top ones. 75% of people, respondents rather, felt that their confidentiality being respected was one of the most important factors. Second most important was understanding their options for disclosure and what types of protections were available for whistleblowers. Next one, which was not far behind in terms of 60% of respondents reported that knowing that there would be consequences or corrective actions was a key factor. And then 54% felt that their managers and supervisors knowing about disclosure processes was a key factor. So these are all the results are all broken down in the survey results report, which you would find quite interesting if you haven't seen it. The next slide. So this is another interesting finding. The survey asked the respondents to indicate the extent to which their workplace cultures supported the reporting of serious misconduct. So only 35% indicated that their organizational culture would either fully or largely support the reporting of serious misconduct. 40% thought it would not support it at all or only slightly, with about a quarter of respondents landing in the middle. So next slide. This is an important finding as well with regard to how familiar public servants were with the PSDPA processes. So as I said, the task force heard this from stakeholders as well, but the survey results indicated that nearly 60% of respondents were either not at all familiar or only slightly familiar with the disclosure processes. And less than 20% were moderately or extremely familiar with them, and that would include all of us who've worked in investigations offices as senior officers or those parties, people who've been party to wrongdoing processes. So quite significant. This survey, the report itself, the main report also included a number of quotes taken directly from survey respondents. And one of them that is tied to this was a response of an individual who said that they had worked in their organization for 17 years and had never heard of the PSDPA. And they mentioned they were a manager. So again, just reinforcing this lack of awareness being a significant issue. Next slide. So the survey also asked people to report whether they had witnessed serious misconduct in their own workplace, and 44% indicated that they had. Of those 44%, 2/3 found it to be a traumatic experience, and 58% reported the misconduct. And the next slide asked the same questions in terms of reprisals. So the number of respondents who had witnessed reprisals, the percentage was 34%. And of that number, nearly the same number, close to 2/3 had indicated that it was a traumatic experience for them. Only 28% reported reprisal versus 58% who said that they would report the misconduct. Sorry, said that they actually did report the misconduct. So the survey, as I said, touched on culture, and there were some positive findings. One of which was that the majority of respondents felt a sense of community at work, which is one of the elements of indicators of mental health, which is a positive finding. But there were some concerning results around accountability, with less than half of respondents saying they were comfortable raising concerns in their workplace. Again, less than half of respondents felt comfortable raising concerns in their workplace. Only 32% felt that problems would be effectively addressed in their organization, and only 35% felt that people are held accountable for their actions. So those were other important findings from the survey result. And just a note there that obviously these statistics, this data reflects the responses of those who chose to complete the survey. It can't be applied to the entire public service, but nonetheless, it's a significant number of people and important data to consider. Next slide. So in terms of key results, obviously lack of awareness of the Act, lack of understanding of the Act, lack of awareness of disclosure processes, with many public servants indicating that they did not know how to report wrongdoing within their organization. And of course, that would include managers, who are one of the 3 avenues for reporting wrongdoing. That is supervisors, senior officers for internal disclosure, as well as the external option of going to the Public Sector Integrity Commissioner. So there was a low confidence in the system. There was a fear of reprisal that remained an obstacle to reporting, and many people were doubtful of the efficacy of protections for whistleblowers. And many respondents also indicated in their answers that even if something was reported, they weren't necessarily confident that the matter would be addressed. The survey, just as an aside, had quite a few open-ended questions, so there was a great deal of narrative, qualitative data that was collected during the course of the analysis. Okay, next slide. So in terms of the findings, again, culture is a pretty key factor in terms of people's comfort in speaking up, given the fear of reprisal. So there was a lot of skepticism about how well the processes actually worked in their organization. So there was a need for systemic changes that was clearly identified by the task force to ensure more accountability and transparency in the workplace. So the disclosure system was seen as very complex and hard to navigate. Given the variety of recourse mechanisms available, there was confusion around that, which ones were the right ones to use given the specific matter that they wanted to report, and also confusion around who's responsible for what. As I mentioned earlier, quite a bit of variability amongst organizations as well, so lack of consistency in how the PSDPA is being implemented. With regard to recommendations on the next slide, so in terms of recommendations around the disclosure regime itself, the task force recommended that procedures be simplified. They recommended that the exclusions that currently apply to 3 organizations be eliminated so that the Canadian Armed Forces, Canadian Security Establishment, and the Security and Intelligence Service organizations now be covered by the PSDPA. That's one of the key recommendations. They also recommended that guidance be improved and that accessibility and transparency be improved as well. Another recommendation was that the notice of occurrence process for harassment and violence complaints be reviewed because they had heard that from the stakeholders and the survey results and so on, that people did not feel it was effective for addressing issues of harassment, some of which get referred to PSIC, even though it's not their mandate. So that system, which was introduced in January 2021, is up for review and is, from what I understand, currently being reviewed, the notice of occurrence process. With regard to protections, the task force recommendations included broadening the list of individuals who are protected, which should include those who are involved in conducting and managing investigations, which are not who are not currently protected under the legislation, those who are mistaken to have been disclosures, those who support disclosures, and so on. They also recommended expanding the list of reprisal actions that relate to people's employment and working conditions. They wanted to simplify the reprisal regime, including eliminating the Public Servants Disclosure Protection Tribunal and introducing a reverse onus into reprisal processes. So that means when the Public Sector Integrity Commissioner finds reasonable grounds to believe that reprisal occurred, the onus would be then on the employer to show that reprisal had not occurred, rather than the way it is now with the complainant having to provide that assurance. Recommendations also included improvements to legal support, including increasing the fees available and recommending that they be reviewed periodically and providing better psychological support to whistleblowers. So finally, with regard to recommendations around the culture and administration and operation of the Act, the task force recommended that there be audit or other mechanisms in place to ensure that the requirements of the Act are met. And they recommended additional responsibilities for Treasury Board Secretariat around providing guidance for the Act and disclosure processes, including guidance on the conduct of investigations, because there's, again, an inconsistency across the public sector with regard to that for a number of reasons. They also made several recommendations that touched on training, and they recommended that the Treasury Board have additional responsibility for training, including training mechanisms, as well as ethical leadership and some other topics that are in the report. The accountability that I mentioned earlier, the recommendations around holding chief executives accountable for the implementation of the Act in their organizations and measuring that through performance assessments. And they recommended that the PSES, a Public Service Employee Survey, include questions on ethical leadership, ethical culture, and psychological health and safety. So to wrap things up, the final slide, the key takeaways here are that there is a insufficient knowledge of the Act and the mechanisms for disclosure and protection, a lack of confidence in the system, fear of reprisals, a need to strengthen the protections available for whistleblowers, and that need for organizational change I mentioned earlier. So that the review and especially the survey conformed confirmed that there's a gap between the intent of the legislation and the lived experience of public servants. And their recommendations focus on building that trust, simplifying procedures, strengthening organizational culture, and also protection for whistleblowers. They made 17 recommendations that relate specifically to the disclosure process, 10 that relate to protections for whistleblowers, and 8 that relate to organizational culture and the administration of the act within organizations. So those are the links there, hyperlinks to the report and the survey results report. If you haven't had a chance to look at them, I found the report, easy to follow, easy to read, and obviously quite interesting from my personal and professional experience. So that's it. Si vous avez des questions, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Yes, Sarah?
Hi, Jessie. Thanks so much for the presentation. Very interesting. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the next steps and timelines for implementation of these recommendations.
Yeah, so the reports are currently being reviewed. Obviously, the report was made to the president of the Treasury Board. There will be a response to the report, an official response in due time once the analysis is complete, and decisions are made around recommendations for next steps. So that process of analysis is still ongoing. So I can't give you a specific timeline yet. There's a timeline and steps, and we're getting towards that as best we can.
Thank you.
You're welcome. D'autres questions? I'm seeing something in the chat as well. So there's a question, could we get a copy of the presentation? Yes, you had mentioned, Bob, that although today's slides are half English and half French, there will be English and French versions of the full presentation available on the EPAC website a little bit later for those of you who want copies. So Bob, you had mentioned people could put maybe their email addresses in the chat if you wanted to get on a list specifically. Otherwise, check the EPAC website in a little bit, and those will be available. Is it possible to share the links to the report and the survey results here in the chat? Certainly, I can do that right now. And there's another question. I'll just give me a moment here. I'll just pop these 2 links in the chat right now so that they're easily accessible. So those are the 2 reports. There you are. And obviously French and English, just click on the option there. Dr. Braun, hello. You have a question?
Hi, yeah. Well, it's actually a double-barreled question. One is sort of the nuts and bolts and how things worked behind the scenes. I'm kind of curious about how the study was designed because it had some really interesting features to it. I like the vignette survey. I thought that was quite intriguing. The general survey. So was that put together by the task force itself, or was there a support staff that was helping them design this? And what kind of methods would be used? I was kind of curious about that. And there's the second thing, sort of the follow-up question to that is there's a frequent mention of best practices within the report itself. And I'm sort of curious which best practices were looked at. I looked at it myself, and there are some really big improvements across best practices, but more in some areas than others.
So to answer your first question, in terms of the survey itself, that was designed by 2 members of the task force who were academic. We had 2 legal academics on the task force, and they designed the survey, and then they contracted out the number crunching to an external firm that produced a number of various runs of the data, which were then incorporated into the findings and fed into the recommendations. So that was by the task force itself, members. There was a support team there, and I was part of that team, and they did a lot of the, background research and note-taking, facilitation. It was a volunteer task force, so we were there to assist in moving things along, scheduling the meetings, pulling things together, and so on. And in terms of best practices, I mean, I have to know which ones you're referring to specifically, but the task force did, as I mentioned, hear from many stakeholders and experts. So they had a lot of info coming in, as well as the recommendations coming out of the OGO report and PSIC recommendations as well that informed their recommendations. So I'd have to see the specific ones perhaps that you're referring to, but there were a number of sources that fed into those. And those best practices, some of them were provided in the written submissions to the task force. Others were in the meetings that were held with various organizations, stakeholders, and that list of stakeholders is in the report. So there were, a lot of them were virtual meetings with different organizations and that, input from senior officers for internal disclosure and other experts in the field. And so those all fed into the best practices. I hope that answers your question. Is it?
Yeah, if I could follow up, first to say, I think you're underestimating the amount of work that you must have done. The qualitative analysis alone must have taken many, many hours, I can imagine. So, pat on the back for that. That's fairly impressive. Yeah, the best practices I'm talking about, there's a few around. There's Transparency International has one, actually a couple, I think, at this point. There's the Government Accountability Project has one. And, there's a couple of international organizations that also have them. They're usually practitioner designed and usually based on experience. Over time, of course, everybody's tried to make the perfect whistleblowing law, and there's always somebody who tries to find a way through the loophole, shall we say. That's the kind of thing I was speaking to.
And was your question that were those included, or was the question, had the task force considered them?
Yeah, it was more, had they considered them, because I've done this kind of analysis, and I've looked at, okay, sort of a list of best practices, and I look to see if the law matches up with them and where it does and where it doesn't.
So they did look at best practices from an international perspective. They also looked at Canadian provincial disclosure systems and so on. And so, it was a fairly wide range, looked at research as well. There were a lot of discussion papers prepared. So that's what they ended up with after their review, but it was quite a broad net at the outset. Yeah. Okay. Carolina?
Oui, bonjour. Merci beaucoup pour la présentation. Ça fait plaisir d'écouter. Il y a un point qui m'a inquiété le plus dans les sondages, en fait, c'est le manque de confiance que les problèmes vont être résolus. Et ça enchaîne, en fait, l'affaire pratique de tous les jours dans les organisations, parce que le problème ne se résout pas. Ma question, c'est est-ce qu'il y a une possibilité à votre niveau d'avoir une certaine fermeté à inclure des possibilités de résolution qui seront bien claires au niveau des manuels de politique des organisations à travers le Canada, que ce soit les organisations à but non lucratif ou bien les organisations fédérales ou provinciales. Est-ce qu'il y a quelque chose qui peut mettre sur place, à table, des possibilités de résolution bien claires que à chaque fois qu'une personne va lire ou va voir le manuel de politique, va dire oui, ça va être résolu, oui, le problème ne va pas se répéter. Je ne sais pas si c'est clair ou pas.
Juste pour clarifier ta question, c'est que est-ce que ça sera possible de mettre en place des processus ou
des processus qui maintiennent une certaine façon de garantir que les problèmes vont être résolus. Ce n'est pas l'affaire juste de procéder avec une plainte et par la suite, le process va continuer, la procédure va continuer sans aboutir à rien. Alors,
Oui.
c'est ce qui m'inquiète le plus parce que le tout peut être mis de jour en jour, ça peut évoluer. Par contre, la confiance, c'est quelque chose qui
Ouais.
est bien, bien dangereuse. C'est ça.
Absolument. Puis ça,
Ouais.
ça fait partie de la culture et le leadership éthique aussi, qui sont
Oui,
les
c'est
points,
ça.
les facteurs les plus importants. Mais pour répondre à tes questions, le groupe de travail, ça fait part de la recommandation pour améliorer les conseils qui sont donnés. C'est les recommandations pour développer des procédures, des conseils pour clarifier les étapes qui doivent être prises, comme euh, ce qui doit être en place pour assurer que les problèmes soient résolus de façon appropriée. S'il rencontre la définition de l'acte répréhensible ou non. C'est-à-dire pour clarifier quoi faire avec les choses qui sont rapportées et comment répondre aux problèmes, effectivement. Alors, ça va venir.
Merci.
Yeah. Juste un petit point additionnel. Les conseils, c'est une chose, la culture, c'est la réalité. Et c'est pour cette raison que le groupe de travail aussi fait plusieurs recommandations par rapport aux cultures. Puis ça prend, comme on sait très bien, des années à changer la culture. Et ils vont avoir des mesures prises pour soutenir les changements. Okay, I'm just checking the chat here. There are also best practices. Okay. Okay, so more best practices there. Thank you for the link. Et Jean Blaise, how could decision makers proceed so that disclosures and investigators be more familiar with the PSDPA and upcoming task force recommendations? So, several things. There was a presentation that I gave at the Interdepartmental Network of Internal Disclosure. So that's for all SOIDs and individuals in SOID offices. That was last month. I also gave a presentation to all of the practitioners in the Interdepartmental Network of Values and Ethics. There's this talk here today. There's also on there's on GC Exchange, many of you may know. Those of you in the public sector should hopefully be members of the GC Exchange site for senior officers for internal disclosure. And in that site, we've assembled all of the guidance on the PSDPA, currently available on canada.ca, as well as information for practitioners internal to the public service that is currently being updated and reviewed. So there are many resources there. It's a community that can share resources and guidance. So that's available. I'm assuming that all the SOID offices would be sharing that with all their staff, individuals. I know Jean Blaise here at D&D, so there's the internal disclosure office, and then there's the investigations team. So all members should have access to those sites and be if you need to join that community, you can message me separately and I can send you the link for the individual who can add you onto that list. But there are a number of resources available, so I hope that answers the question. Bob, you had a question? I guess it's getting close to the end.
Yes, thank you. First, I'm going to switch back to this final slide, not yours, but the final one of that we put up, which invites people to send in comments on the on this webinar and their suggestions for the future and so forth. And I'll put that up in approximately 7 minutes at 5 to 1. But the other reason I wanted to intervene at this point was to comment on the issue that Carolina brought up about lack of confidence that something worthwhile will actually happen if somebody does disclose, and your discussion with her about strengthening procedures and making sure that people know them. I just want to add I hope it's not an overly pessimistic comment, that when senior leaders are not sure whether dealing properly with disclosure is going to be counted as a success or as a failure, because If there was a valid disclosure and it was dealt with properly, well, that should be a success. But meanwhile, it means that the senior leader presided over an organization where wrongdoing happened, and that's perceived as a failure. And in my experience, I can only think of one example where perhaps one could say that that circle was squared, and that was subsequent to the resignation of the head of a small agency that dealt with privacy. Subsequent to that resignation, that person had been alleged to have been guilty of various sorts of wrongdoings. The person who replaced him for 6 months really made huge changes that really dealt with the situation very well. But that was two different people. And I'm not aware of the most senior leadership of the federal government celebrating that success. And until those until those instances are celebrated and held up as positive examples of how people should act, because everybody wants to pretend that they're perfect, and so you don't talk about these things. Until that becomes part of the culture, I worry about how thoroughly these processes will be implemented.
Yeah, so I've got a couple of points to say, and that's thank you for raising that. One is around awareness. If in some cases there are actions taken and appropriate actions taken that people may not be aware of. So there's the task force made recommendations around public reporting, which is key in people getting things done, being seen to address issues as well. The clerk of the Privy Council also made a recommendation for organizations to produce a report on misconduct and wrongdoing. It was not a forever thing, it was a 1-year thing, but organizations did that. And the whole idea behind that was to build that trust by showing employees within the organization that measures are being taken. So they were to report on, and it included everything: harassment, grievances, wrongdoing, and so on and so forth. So that's one element of it. But the other one is a good point. So I managed harassment complaints at one point in my career. I've worked as an investigator, managed investigations, and it's that perception, right? If any report of wrongdoing is seen as a bad thing, then there's going to be pressure to reject, reduce, not highlight things. And likewise for harassment, I was managing harassment complaints during the Me Too movement, where the numbers skyrocketed. So you could either say it's a terrible thing, oh my gosh, it's not that there was more harassment happening, it's that more people were coming forward, which is a good thing because you want to address these sorts of situations, right? So yeah, in reality, if there's numbers going up, you could see it as bad. You could also see it as a positive thing in that it's reflecting people's comfort in coming forward. And as a leader, you would want things to be brought to your attention. It's also part of your responsibility, right, to address matters. So, that's a good point. That's around culture change. It's around communication. It's around, transparency, people being held accountable. And I could talk for another hour about culture and stuff because I've been working in ethics for many, many years. But that's a good point. There's that change in perception and a recognition that it's a good thing to be hearing about problems. And by the time it gets to a formal complaint of some kind, you're at the end of the road. You want to hear about things earlier rather than later and resolve them at lower levels where possible. So you want people to be comfortable reporting things as soon as they're noticed. Yeah. So anyway, big piece of the culture. Thank you for that. Any other questions? So there's other notes. There's also the issue of how the media presents successfully exposed wrongdoing. Yes. If at some point in the future we have effective whistleblower protection in Canada, the media will need to be educated to report on these cases as successful anti-corruption efforts rather than as scandals. Yes, absolutely right. That's part of that, culture change, communication. And thank you, Morag. Also, just backtracking a bit, I see that you've put in a number of links there. There's a video that the Integrity and Ethics team in TBS put out, video for new senior officers for internal disclosure. And then other links that she's included then they're related to the disclosure process. So thank you for that. These should reflect positively on the leadership and the department's concern. Yeah, that has a lot to do with the leadership. And that's an important role for a chief executive in terms of communicating their openness to hearing things, their support, and effective management of misconduct and wrongdoing when it is reported, as well as protection of whistleblowers. So all key points for this whole topic.
Thank you, Jessie. At this point, I'm going to bring up that last slide that I mentioned. And while I do so, I'd like to invite Nick Seguin, who I see is has joined in. And Nick, if you could unmute yourself. Nick is our new president of EPAC, and I'd like to invite him to thank our speaker and encourage more people to join EPAC and send us your suggestions. Over to you, Nick.
Well, I wanted to extend a sincere thank you on behalf of EPAC to Jessie. Thank you so much for coming out today and taking the time to share your insightful presentation on the new direction for whistleblower protections. Puis, je vais répéter en français. Merci beaucoup à Jessie MacNeil pour votre présentation et pour le temps que vous avez consacré aujourd'hui. C'est très apprécié. Je vois qu'il y a vraiment beaucoup de gens qui se sont joints aujourd'hui. Donc, merci à tous et à toutes pour d'avoir participé et d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. We truly appreciate your engagement, so thank you. And like Bob said, please join EPAC. We want to hear, we want anyone that's interested in learning more about values and ethics and conflicts of interest to join us and learn more. EPAC is Ethics Practitioners Association of Canada. And so we have discussions like this, we have webinars, we have guest speakers, and on our website, we also have, we're starting a podcast that has information on conflicts of interest and anything that has to do with values and ethics. We are also here to answer questions. If something comes up and you would like to discuss it with one of our board members, that is what we're here for as well. So again, before I pass it over to Bob for you to close this amazing webinar, thank you again. And I really hope that you all enjoyed this session. Donc, je passe la parole à Bob. Donc, merci à tous.
Thank you very much, Nick. Also, please leave the session going until we hit 1 o'clock, so people can copy down any of this information or go into your the chat area to write your comments, peut-être votre opinion sur le webinaire ou comment les améliorer, aussi que les thèmes des futurs webinaires possibles. And especially, some of you are probably in a position to share some of your experience and some of your guidance. So how could you contribute specifically as either a single speaker like Jessie was today, or as a member of a panel perhaps, or contribute in some other manner to sharing ethics knowledge around our country and into its different kinds of organizations. That's why we exist, and we hope that we can get more assistance in doing so. Jessie, do you have any final word other than perhaps we should send in a recommendation that Jessie should get some sort of promotion to make sure that she can do even more good work in this area?
Well, thank you, everybody. Stay tuned. More to come is my final word on that. And luckily, I've been my secondment to Treasury Board has been extended. I'll be there for another couple of years working on this. So keen to continue progress in this area.
Thank you. So we'll pencil you in for a 1-year follow-up around this time next year. Okay. So let's hear about the progress
Sure.
that's been made over the year. Thank you. Merci à tous pour votre participation aujourd'hui. C'est un de nos plus grands succès jusqu'à date pour nos webinaires en termes de participation.
Merci beaucoup. Bonne journée tout le monde.
Merci. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Did you want me to sign off, Bob, or stay on the line?
Osama, can you end the webinar now? Yeah, Jessie, go ahead and sign off.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks a lot, Jessie. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jessie.